All right.
Hey.
So, hi. I can't see some of you, which, if you're driving, I understand. So like be safe. And for those of you who it's your first time here with us, in our Q&A, and oh, there's Jeremy. I was like, I lost you for a second. I was like trying to find your face in the boxes. Today is just a really casual Q&A, right? Like I like to bring in individuals and speakers, basically who are either doing what you're doing or doing what we're doing, right? So they're either super marketing focused or super operational focused. And this is our opportunity to really ask whatever's on our mind about the topic. Jeremy is, and I'll let him do a much better introduction than I will. He is really an expert in podcasting. One of our podcasting godfathers, if it were. And it's just such a pleasure to have him here, as I know tons of you are either doing podcasting as guests, are having your own podcasts, and at all levels. So it's such a pleasure to have you, Jeremy. And I'm going to take the first 10 minutes because I can, and ask sort of my heart-burning questions that I have about podcasting and really like how that translates to how you're running your business and the operations of podcasting, because we like to be on brand. And then I'm going to open this up as a Q&A. So rules of the Q&A for those of you who have not been here. First one to unmute goes first. If not, either raise your hand, put it in the comments, and you guys are always so good about this. It's usually easy peasy. Jeremy, is there anything else you wanna say to kind of like give some context to the group?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks so much for having me. And I already see I see some friendly faces. Mark, good to see you here, who initially made the introduction to Juliana. So yeah, really, really excited to be here with this group. A little bit of background on me. So I currently run a education program and platform called Podcast Marketing Academy, which, as it says on the tin, is all about the marketing side of podcasting. But I initially got into podcasting through the technical side. So I went to audio engineering school and worked in the music industry for a bit before kind of porting that over to the online business space, which podcasting was a much better fit than producing records and playing music and all that kind of fun stuff. My goal was to travel full time, which I have for the past 7 years. And so kind of ended up starting out as a freelance podcast producer and editor, and then grew an agency around that, and still have the agency going, but it's kind of winding down as I'm focusing more on the education and content side of things. So I can kind of speak to all aspects of podcasting, from the technical, like, audio production, recording, editing, all that kind of side of things, to the building a production agency and operationalizing all of that. And then now kind of marketing is my focus and what I'm most obsessed about. And on the creative side of things as well. So kind of anything and everything is fair game within that. And looking forward to chatting with everyone.
All right, very cool. And so I want you to do some bragging and name dropping. What are some of the, I'm like, let's just do it. What are some of the big names that you've worked with, just to give people a breadth of context around, who you've worked with, the good, the bad, the oogle. Tell us.
Yeah, so the biggest would be Tony Robbins, and produced a couple seasons of their show 2 years ago or so. I think it was the holiday season. It must have been going into 2022, 2021, 2022, a pretty like sound design heavy narrative style show. And so worked with their team to kind of bring that to life over a couple seasons. Have also worked with Salesforce in the past on, they have many shows, but have worked with, I know when they did Dreamforce, their live conference, they do a podcast for that every year, did a number of seasons of that with them. And then more recently have worked with Ali Abdal and his team when it comes to their podcast, spinning that. They already had it created, but they're kind of like looking to level that up and bring more people, kind of like bolster the YouTube channel presence that they already have with, 3 million subscribers, 4 million subscribers, something like that. And then kind of building up the podcast alongside that. So those would probably be some of the most recognizable names. But then there've been some other tech companies and a lot of solopreneurs, and then work kind of coming in alongside marketing agencies, things like that, who are offering other services to their kind of business oriented clients.
Cool. That's awesome. So now everybody has an idea of what we're talking about. So, so let's geek out on operations. When you're doing podcasting, what do you like? What have you seen be the most effective team structure when you're creating a podcast, right? Because there's so much to it, right? Like everyone, a lot of the content creators that I know are like, Juliana, you should do a podcast, and I'm like, fuck no, that's so much work. Not right now, right? So I'm curious to know, like what have you seen be a really effective team structure?
Yeah, so I think it depends a lot. There's so many ways you can create a podcast. And so nowadays, a lot of people are, also adding the video element. And so that adds some more complexity. Videos adds quite a bit of time, potentially another team members. You can get people who are often decent at both video and audio, and that's not always the case. And a lot of the people who I know do a podcast well that is both like well-produced video as well as well-produced audio, and it works in both mediums, have two people. So they have a video editor who often does like an initial pass for the video, and then the audio editor will do some additional editing to produce the audio version for the audio only feed. You can kind of combine that into one if you want to like, this is another thing for a lot of people, depending on what the purpose of your show is. Maybe you're going to optimize for one platform and say like, okay, it's primarily an audio first, but we're just going to put up kind of like a half-assed version to YouTube, and like, that I'm not trying to win at YouTube, but I'm going to get some extra juice out of that. And so, maybe video is just good enough. And you can also do it vice versa, where we're producing video first and just the audio is just good enough, and I'm actually not going to bring on an extra audio editor. We'll just like publish it as is. So you can kind of do that, but it does depend on like what kind of format you're looking for. I would say, it also depends on what style of show you're doing. So if you're doing an interview show, probably you want somebody like a podcast manager on your team who can handle a lot of times like the term podcast manager is a kind of podcast VA. It is like one of the things with podcasting is like the terms are pretty fluid, like what a producer means, what an editor means. All of these things are kind of like individual to, a lot of people will use them differently in their business, but a podcast manager is typically a pretty catch-all term. They may do research for you on your guests. If you have guests on, they may do a lot of that outreach and kind of like organizing. Maybe they're even coming up with scripts or questions, things like that, depending on how well you've trained them, how well they understand your business and your style. So I would say that that's one of the very probably early hires that you would want to have and bring onto your team. I would say like, an editor, probably you don't want to be doing that, and potentially a podcast manager. Those are kind of the two core team members. I think a lot of times the podcast manager will also do the show notes, all the uploading, all that kind of back end stuff. And so I would say those two roles, podcast manager and then either audio and or video editor, would be the kind of core of the podcast team.
Yeah. And I'm just going to cut it in the middle, call it podcast coordinator, just for, and so and I know like back in the day, pre-pandemic, 3 years ago. So we like a lot of sourcing for coordinator type positions was done via Upwork and, maybe like Philippines PH. But now those platforms have gotten a little different, right? Like they've changed, they've transformed. Where do you see people sourcing, sort of these individuals that might be more low cost from other parts of the world that are still really good places to source these from if you don't have, full-time work for this type of position?
Yeah, I've still seen both of those, Upwork and like onlinejobs.ph.
That's all one.
So yeah, it can, it can be a little bit harder to find nowadays than maybe it was in the past. I think there's also a lot more people who are specializing in like podcast manager roles. And so I'm, in a somewhat fortunate position where I'm just like in the podcast industry and have lots of connections. And so for me, it's often like, who do I know who's doing this? I actually have several members of my kind of education platform and membership who are podcast managers, and many of whom are in the Philippines. And so I should actually ask them where they advertise their services. I just usually refer them and recommend them, and based on bandwidth. And so that's, I'm in a good position where I just am surrounded by people. My friend Lauren, what is her I think it's Podcast Manager School. She has a podcast called the Podcast Manager Show, and she
Hmm.
trains podcast managers and then has like a marketplace to be able to refer them. And so I often go
Oh,
to
that's
her
cool.
and I'll ask, like, who's been through your program, who do you trust? And that would be a recommendation that I have. And her, I'll just put her name in here if anyone wants to look her up. Lauren
Yeah, that'd be
Reddy.
huge. Because we'll
I
put
think
any
it's fun.
resources in the Tinker Talks just so that you can have these in the future with along with like Jeremy's all his stuff. So that'll be really cool. Okay. And then my last, well, I have two more questions. One, what have you seen in terms the good, the bad, and the ugly of project managing your podcast pre, post, guest, production, and what tools do you use, do you recommend to your clients? So I'm curious about that piece.
Yeah, I mean, this is true with any hire, but
Mhm.
kind of having inflated expectations around what the team can and can't do. And I think a lot of times, depending on the host, and I think this is especially true. Well, this is a whole separate side tangent, but like just expecting the podcast to both be successful and take almost none of your time is not going to happen. Like, I think a well done podcast that actually works like is going to take a significant amount of your time. Like, I think nobody wants to listen to a show where the host just like shows up for 30 minutes and like that's all the work that they're putting into it, does the interview, and that's it. Like, I think good interviews, unless you're in a completely uncrowded space where yours is the only show on your topic, is the only place people can go to get that information, like the bar has been raised for the quality of podcasts and what listeners expect from shows. And that doesn't necessarily mean from a production side of things. Like, that's easy enough to do well, and especially outsourced. But I think from just an ideas perspective, and like that, I think just takes time. And so like there's probably somebody out there who is going to put more effort in than just like the guest fills out the forum, you ask them all their like pre-submitted questions, and it just there are so many shows like that nowadays. They used to work really well where you could just like churn out an episode a day or 3 episodes a week or whatever it was, and put very little effort in, and have that work really well for your business. There are ways to do that if your goal is not growing the show. If your goal is to use the podcast as a opportunity to talk with potential leads, that can work actually pretty well. And so that's certainly a business model that a lot of people take with podcasts. I've been on many shows like that as a guest, and I'm always have a little bit of a weird taste in my mouth afterwards. I'm like, yeah, okay, this is like, I don't know if I'm actually getting anything out of this other than a soft being sold to, kind of. And there's some like kind of like nice connections, but you can do that really badly too, that actually leaves a bad taste in people's mouth. And so I would be wary about that. But when it comes to actually, if you're looking to produce a show that's building an audience, I think understanding that like you as the host ultimately need to drive this thing from a strategy perspective and a content perspective. And a lot of people want to offload that and say, just tell me what to create about and I'll do it. And I think that can work better with blogging, where it's a little bit less personal. But I think the reason people come back to podcasts is because they like the host, and you probably come in for the topic, but the reason you stick around is going to be because you have some connection with the host. And I think that there needs to be some vision for the show that only you can actually create. And so that's not something you can outsource. And so I think that's one of the reasons I don't have a podcast right now. I'm probably going to start another one in the future. I've created several in the past, but for me, I like put off so long because I'm like, I should have a podcast, but I don't really know why. I understand why I would have a podcast, but I don't have any vision behind any idea, at the time. And so I'm kind of like, what's the point of doing this? This is going to take a ton of time. It's not going to gain any traction, and it's ultimately going to be a waste. And so I think I think we've kind of moved past the phase of the kind of like FOMO around podcasting, maybe like 3 years ago, 5 years ago. Like,
Mhm.
everybody had a podcast, and I mean, it's still blowing up, but I think
Mhm.
we've reached a stage where like we need to have a little bit more thoughtfulness. And so I would say having that yourself before you start building out the team, and then very clearly understanding like the limitations of each person and what they can and can't do. Things like content editing, that's another one that it's really hard to hire a podcast editor who's also going to be cutting out big chunks of the content to make a compelling narrative. That's usually something that always sticks with the host. And maybe you're not doing like a big narrative podcast, but if you're saying, I want to do a 2-hour interview and cut it down to an hour, that will take a lot of training to get an editor to be able to intuitively make the same cuts that you would. And not everybody does that. And a lot of people say, I do, whatever, 2-hour or 60-minute or 45-minute interview, and that's basically what gets published. The editor just cleans it up for ums and ahs and whatever. But I think if you do have a bit more of a editorial approach to your show, that's something that I would expect you to do, at least one pass through and cut that out. And then you get into a lot of the other things on the like show notes and blog posts and that kind of side of things as well, that a lot of times where I see it break down is that the hosts have this expectation that all this incredible content will be able to be like, everything is like, perfect SEO optimized blog post, but they're paying somebody, not that much to be able to do that. And they're like, oh, this is just basically like a basic set of show notes or a basic transcript or whatever. And like, why isn't this like a perfectly produced SEO optimized blog post? And like, well, you got to pay somebody a lot who has that skill set, and that may or may not overlap with, a podcast manager or show notes writer or something like that. So I think there's so much, I think a lot of expectations with podcasting. There's so much talk about how it can be used as your primary content creation kind of platform, that then you can spin off all this content. But spinning off all that content and doing it well takes a lot of time. And it's not just like snap your fingers and, pay somebody $15 an hour and you're going to get this amazing, media company that you've all of a sudden spun up. And so, yeah, I think expectations management, as with everything, is one of the keys there.
Thank you so much for that. All right, I'm going to open up to the group. Who has questions for Jeremy? Both on the hosting side, the team side, and the guesting side. How to be a good guest. Yes, Stephen, go for it.
I'll go. So, Jeremy, from your perspective, because I know this could be a really, really long list, but if you were to narrow it down to like your top 3 pieces, of advice that you would give to a host or a prospective host, like do these 3 things and be really, really great at these 3 things to have a decent show, what would your experience say are those 3 things?
Yeah, so the first one, this is my favorite thing, and the one I just hammer home the most. It's also pretty hard to do well, but is thinking about like creating a differentiated show format or concept. And so especially in business, there are so many shows that are like, there are probably hundreds or thousands of shows that are like interviews with successful people so you can learn from them. And that worked pretty well 10 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe even. And it is just really hard to do that well and actually stand out. And so basically you can still build a show around that, but you are going to have to market the crap out of that to actually get people into it. And so I think paying attention to creating a unique kind of show concept. And so from the outside, people can see like, oh, this is not like other shows in this category. And so there's a lot of kind of like concept archetypes that I think about. But I would just start by like, when you are coming across podcasts that do stand out to you, that you keep coming back to, just like taking a minute to think about like, why do I keep coming back to this? What's interesting about this? Or paying attention when, I mean, this exists on, TV shows and YouTube channels and newsletters and podcasts and everywhere, is this like idea of format or concept. And I think starting to pay attention to what gets your own like ears to perk up is a good kind of idea to always be on the lookout for, and then seeing how you can apply that to your show. So one of the examples that I use a lot of times, I can give a couple here. There's a show called 3 Books. The host is Neil Pazrika, I think. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his last name. But his show concept, he basically interviews like authors and kind of, famous people who do tons of interviews, and you can listen to interviews with them anywhere. And so it's hard to build a show around that, because like, why would we pick you when I could hear the best interview in the world or the best interviewer in the world interview them somewhere else? And so his show concept and how he's differentiated it is, he said, okay, in each episode, we're going to bring these people on. Maybe you've heard them elsewhere, but we're going to specifically ask them about the 3 books that were most formative to them in their life. And so all of a sudden it's like, that's a really, really simple show format. But what's interesting about it is that every episode will be different, because everybody's going to have 3 different books. And even if they chose the same books, they're going to have taken different things away from those books. And so it provides this really simple structure for the episode that is also really hooky. From the outside, we can already get like, oh, that's an interesting way to explore a conversation with this person. And a lot of times I think people avoid this because they think I mean, I think they think that it's going to be formulaic or something. Whereas if you pick the right kind of constraint or box to create into, like that show concept is actually not going to be formulaic at all. Yeah, you talk about 3 books each and every episode, but because the guests are different and are bringing their own unique perspectives and books to it, like, you know, it's just going to be unique every time. And I think the other thing is that people want to explore more terrain. They say, well, I want to hear about like the whole journey of this person that they've taken, when what really happens is you actually get more into the nuance and depth when you bring a really constrained format to it. Because okay, we're talking about, you know, 3 books in this person's journey. Yeah, I want to know about their career. I want to know how they became successful or whatever. That's like what most podcast hosts think audiences want to know about, which is maybe true. But what happens when you bring a format like that is you actually get all into all of that stuff, except it's through a guided kind of journey that has more structure to it, that is actually less formulaic. And it's actually, you get into the stories that people might not share otherwise, because you're not kind of coming at it directly where they're on their script. And so, yeah, you talk about, oh, well, this book actually, at this point in my career, I was really stuck, and this book I came across my desk and somebody recommended it. And then, you know, it made me totally reconsider how I was thinking about this thing, which got me unstuck, which leveled me up to here. And so I think thinking about, you know, how can you create almost more constraints on your show in a way that makes it really tangible what people will get out of it. I'll give one more example from a business context, is the show My First Million, which is on the HubSpot network. It's one of the top like 5 or 10 in the business category at any given time. And so their initial show concept, this was before, I think they started it once Sam Parr had already sold The Hustle to HubSpot. And so he was already kind of a big deal, but the podcast was not. It was not really a thing. And their initial show concept was essentially like what I said before. We interview successful founders about, you know, how they've been successful so you can learn from them, which they kind of acknowledged later was like a really boring concept that people could find anywhere. And what they ended up changing it to was something along the lines of every week, we present you with a potential $1 million business idea based on trends and opportunities we see in the market based on our research as experienced founders with multiple exits. Sometimes we have famous guests on and they do it with us. And so immediately there's like a way better hook to that, where it's like, oh, they're doing the research on my behalf as the listener, and they're going to present to me, somebody should make $1 million business here based on this idea. Here's an opportunity, somebody go do it. And it's like, wow, that's a really, really valuable show that I don't need to trust. I mean, it's a bit of a leap to say like, well, can they deliver on it? But it's not just, you know, successful interviews with successful people. It's very differentiated and unique. So that to me is like my main thing. If you can do that well, like everything becomes much, much, much easier in terms of standing out and building a tribe around the show.
Mark, I know you had your hand up before.
Yeah, my mind is bubbling with all sorts of ideas in response to that. Jeremy, good to see you again. So glad you could join us. My question is around, well, I could ask you a ton of questions, but the first one is, do you see any difference in the success of shows where it's solo host, you know, and they're just talking versus interviewing guests?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like one of the things, a lot of people do both, and so they'll mix their format, which is fine. So they'll do some solo shows and some interview shows. And a lot of times what I see from a lot of my students and clients is that the solo shows actually do better, which is really interesting. Among their existing audience, more people will listen to that. And I think if you're going to do an interview show, I think there's multiple ways to think about this too. And so I'm a huge fan of the jobs to be done framework, if anybody knows that. And so I think it starts with a question like, what's the job of this show? And so that can be for your business. It can be for you personally. It can be for the listeners. You could take that lens and apply it to all of those. And so one of the things for me, as I'm thinking about starting a new show, there are a few jobs that I want it to do, and probably different formats will play into those that will give me a reason to do different things. And not all of it will be based on pure what's going to get the most downloads. And so one of the jobs for me will be to help my audience get to know me on a more personal level. So I do a lot of writing, which I think I'm a good writer, and I think I inject a lot of personality into it, but it's just different when you hear somebody or see them on a video. And so I'm thinking about like, okay, I want to do solo shows so people actually get that sense of me. But another one of the jobs that I want to have done is I'm thinking about a book in the future. And so part of, I spend a lot of time in my own head with my own ideas, and writing those is a very like, it's just my perspective basically. And I do research, around some of the things I write about, but really, as I'm thinking about, okay, one day I want to work towards a book, I want to get other people's stories and kind of like test my ideas against other people. So I want to bring in other people purely selfishly to be able to start sourcing stories and hear about, like, also like discover like, where am I wrong about these ideas, and ask some questions, say like, here's how it seems to me. Is this your experience? And pulling some of that in. And so I think neither of those, I mean, one has to do with not audience growth, but audience nurturing. And so it's kind of further down the sales funnel. The other one is just about like testing my ideas and expanding on them, which will surely give me more content to create, but would also lead to, potential book and stuff like that in the future. But from a pure growth perspective of like awareness, I think there is more potential with guests, but I think you have to really, if that's part of your growth plan for the podcast, I think you need to become known as like a singular interviewer, that you are going to get people on and ask them questions that they don't answer anywhere else. And this is actually really interesting. I've noticed this myself. So being in the podcast space for so long, I know that one of the huge pain points that hosts have is that the guests don't share the episodes. And so, I said, whenever I'm guesting, I'm going to like share it above and beyond. I'm going to send it out to my email list, whatever. I'm going to share it on social media. And as I've done more and more interviews, I've actually really started to struggle with that, because every single time I'm like, how do I actually share this with my, it's the same interview every time. It's like, yeah, another interview, me talking about podcast marketing and growth. It's like, there's no interesting hook for me to share it as a guest. And so I just feel like, man, my audience, I've beaten them over the head. I've shared like 100 interviews that are all basically the same with them. I have no reason to actually recommend that they listen to this interview, because it's the same. Whereas occasionally one will be vastly different, and I'll be like, wow, that was such a unique interview. I actually really do want to share this with my audience, because nobody's ever asked me these things before. And so I think that can be a powerful growth tool for your podcast, but you have to actually create a show that's very different from what the guests have done before. And so there's a lot of potential there to use interviews as a way to get more exposure. But the other thing I heard somebody talk about recently was he had a kind of controversial hot take on Twitter. He posted this, and I really liked it. He said, I would not, if I had the opportunity to interview James Clear on my podcast. He had a small show, and so James Clear is probably not saying yes. He doesn't even do many interviews, but I probably actually wouldn't even want to interview him, because like, what would I talk to him about that he hasn't talked about already? Actually, who I would want to interview is James Clear's number 2, his operations person. I want to interview that guy and explore, like, that guy hasn't done many interviews probably, and we can explore the behind the scenes of the machine that James Clear has created from somebody else's perspective. And that's actually really interesting. And that guy, maybe he doesn't even have an audience at all, but it's much more interesting of sharing that. It's like, people are just going to be like, oh, we haven't heard, that side of things before. And so that's another way to think about, like, if you're going to do interviews, like, how can you make this something that has a bit more of a hook to it than, something that people can get elsewhere, a bit less of a commodity.
That is fantastic. You validated so many ideas that I had in my head.
Awesome. Glad to hear.
If you'd allow me a follow-up, length of episodes, what works well, what doesn't? Do super long form, the Joe Rogan 2-hour, plus thing, or short form, like 10 minutes?
Again, I think there's, well, I don't know if I've said this before already, so I won't say again, but I do give this answer a lot, that I think it depends so much on your show, your audience, your goals around it. One of my, this was a fascinating insight. One of my students a couple of years ago, he had an 1.5 hour long show, I think hour 45, maybe it was 90 to 2 hours, something in that length. And he was seeing that his retention was really low. It was like below 50% when he looked at his how long his audience was sticking around. And so he decided to cut it down in half to like 1 hour 45 minutes. And his retention went up. But what happened was he discovered that all of his actual clients started complaining. And so what that said to me was that, oh, the people who are most likely to buy from him and become customers, they're the people, not everybody wants the 2-hour long episode, but maybe the people who are most likely to become clients, or who are clients and who the podcast is kind of this added value thing, like, they're the people who want that. And so I think it's interesting sometimes to look at, I remember Seth Godin did a podcast episode on like the gradients of audience or customers or something like that, and how not all customers are created equal, or not all audience members are created equal. And so probably like how I've started thinking about it a lot more is like the people who will become customers, that's who I want to optimize for. I want to optimize for the future buyers. And so it's not going for like what's the most popular thing possible. It's like, how can I, give people, the people who are gonna one day become customers, who are on the fence, like what do they need from me? Do they need a lot of FaceTime with me where they're gonna listen through a 2-hour episode? They're already kind of further down the funnel. They're not just like coming across me for the first time. And so maybe I go along with them and like help them really get to build that relationship with me, versus maybe my podcast actually lives further up my funnel and it is meant to be something that you can get a 5-minute tip from me 3 times a week or whatever, and like that's kind of where the show lives. And so I'm optimizing more for discovery at that stage. So I think it depends based on what the goal of your show is, who's listening to it, and you can make the case too that like there's all these Joe Rogans, Tim Ferriss's, Andrew Huberman's that are 3 hours long, and people listen to them. There's also a lot of really popular shows that are super short. So I think either anything can work, but just understanding like how are people engaging with this and who is engaging with this.
Awesome, thank you.
Just one. It's super short. I promise.
All right. Well, then we'll let somebody else go, and we can come back to you. But
and I think it'll add a lot of value for everyone. Is posting video podcasts to YouTube better for audience discovery purposes versus Spotify and iTunes?
So it can be, but you need to put in a decent, well, I don't even want to say a decent amount. You need to put in a lot of extra work, I would say. So YouTube's like rolled out their new podcasting platform. It seems like they are going to be promoting it, but recently they kind of gave beta access to a bunch of like the New York Times and all these like big media companies. And it's almost comical. I think I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was like in the first, basically the average episode. So let's say like the Daily from the New York Times probably gets millions and millions of podcast downloads. It got like 126 video views on YouTube. So it seems like the early returns on YouTube, like, and they're doing the bare minimum right now. They're kind of just like, it might be like a static screen with the podcast underneath. It's not like video first content or anything. And so if you're just doing that, I would have very limited expectations around it. It certainly, there is more opportunity for discovery there, but I think the people who will do really well and make the most of it are going to probably be producing videos in a way that is engaging to watch the video, which will take, certainly a different style of editing from the podcast, different production values in terms of just, your whole video setup. So I think there's opportunity, but it's also, not just like, I'm just going to post it to YouTube and immediately I'm going to double my viewership count or anything like that. Yeah.
all right. Somebody else have a question? Go for it, Com.
Quick like follow up on Mark's second question. So when you said like I was thinking about the funnel for the content, right? Knowing like awareness is maybe it's shorter, maybe it's like a 15-minute episode. Do you recommend to like maybe have 2 or 3 different lengths, because I know that eventually I'm nurturing that person, or to just stick with like one format? I'm doing 30 minutes.
I think it depends. And you do see people who do both. And you can also, I mean, you could start even multiple shows if you get to that point where like maybe they are even a different premise kind of content. That's kind of how I'm thinking more about it. I think one of the things about podcasting, as opposed to some other kind of content, is that people do build habits around it. And so like every Tuesday morning is like, I listen to this show. And I think that people have some expectation. And I mean, if you establish the habits that, okay, Tuesdays are 15 minutes and Thursdays are an hour, people will get around that. Maybe some people would be like, okay, I only listen to the Tuesday episodes and, I don't do the Thursdays. But I think having some kind of consistency where either it is, you've got these 2 separate formats, maybe they're even named differently. So people in the feed can just see easily like, okay, it's the quick hit, whatever. And then there's like the deep dive on a different day. I think that can work. But I think the problem that comes in sometimes is where people everything just seems to be the same. There's no distinction on the packaging of it, from titling to, just consistency with the days that they're released. And people then all of a sudden, they build into their schedule like, okay, I've got like 15 minutes, for this episode, and all of a sudden you release like an hour and a half long episode there, and it's like, oh, I don't have time for this, so I'm not going to do it. And then they get out of the habit of listening over time. Or people like, they're like, oh, I've got an hour-long commute to work, and this is only 10-minute episode, like now I gotta like find something else there, and there's this like annoyance almost. And so I would be consistent with whatever you do, but I think you can do both of those, and people certainly do. And you can do that in any way. You could do 2 episodes a week, one's short, one's long. You could alternate every other week is short versus long. But I think thinking about like, how does somebody, what are the habits that I'm encouraging people to build around the show so that they can kind of like come to almost rely on it, because people certainly do.
That's perfect. So almost like playlists for YouTube, right? Like you're creating it inside your podcast. Okay.
Yeah, well, and I was going to say, like, that's the other great thing you can do with Spotify is now create actual podcast playlists. And so, especially once you've built up a back catalog, this is one of the best things you can do, is to make playlists of your content. And so maybe if you have certain like content pillars that you address with your show, make playlists for each of those, so that this is what I highly encourage people to do if you're also doing, email marketing, is if you can do any kind of segmentation when they first come onto your list and they say, okay, this is what my biggest challenge is right now, then they click that link and they get an immediate follow-up email and say, hey, here are 3 podcast episodes, or here's this playlist based on this. You said this was the thing that you were most struggling with. Here's all this content that's like curated for you based on your preferences. And you can have that playlist, or you can just like hand curate like the top 3 episodes related to that. And I think like thinking really early on, like, how do we get somebody to go down the rabbit hole really quickly, and curation and personalization goes a long way to that. And so the playlist can really help there as well.
Awesome. That wasn't my original question, Julian. I got my real one, but I wanted to finish that off with Mark. So here's the one I think it's valuable. So operationally, you're saying there's a lot of ways to kind of like get people to onboard or whatever. Like, what are like the key things that you felt from a good experiential standpoint, like getting someone to prepare to come on the show, or like what type of like brand engagements where you're like, you know what, I can tell from just a couple of conversations or emails, like, I want to be on the show because I'm getting asked to be on this guest all the time, but because of these things that Tom did or his team did, like, I can already tell like this is gonna be a different experience.
Yeah, so you're talking about getting a guest to come on your show?
Getting on, or it could be prior, or even like they said yes. Now, like, what do you create to create that like customer experience, right? To kind of get them excited before the show starts. So like, what do we do in there so that they don't like cancel on us or something?
Yeah, this is like, I love this question, because most people, I mean, it's a whole other thing to build up, but I think the guest experience is such an underrated aspect of podcasting, especially when you think about like, this is an opportunity to build a potentially long-term relationship. Not that everyone will, but it certainly happened. And oftentimes those people become, clients or collaborators or partners in some way. And so I think it is worth taking really seriously that guest onboarding and, once you're actually on the call experience. For me, the big thing I notice, like when I'm a guest, is when somebody kind of has that vision I was talking about before, and there's like, this is why I want you specifically to come on. It's not just like, you're an expert in this topic, so I want you to talk about this topic. It's like, you have this unique insight that in my pitch to you, like if it's clear to me that somebody like reads my newsletter and references a specific thing and they say, oh, this like really got me thinking and I really love to explore this topic in more depth with you. That's, to me, is like, oh, this person like knows my work. It resonates with them in some way. And there's a specific reason that they want to do, talk more about this topic that is kind of unique to me and, my ideas. Like that, to me, I'm like very excited every single time to do it. And so I think it's a pretty low bar in some ways of just like having done the research and making it clear that they're just not a commodity that you're, using to be able to like put out more episodes, which it can certainly feel like that sometimes. And so I think I usually recommend doing, at least enough research before making a guest pitch that you can connect with something personally over them. And I think like, one of the things that I'll often say is if you listen through, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours of their, past guest interviews or whatever, you read through their blog posts and you can't come up with anything that's, you personally connect with them on, like maybe you shouldn't be pitching them. And so this can go both ways for shows that you want to be a guest on, or people that you want to have come on your show. And so I think doing that research up front and being able to make a compelling pitch, especially if there's somebody who's like, a few rungs up the ladder, goes a long way. And then I think about also kind of to that point I was talking about with Mark before, is like, what's that unique angle maybe that they haven't talked about before? And so maybe it is in line with their content and stuff like that. But if you're able to come up, and another example, I think this is in the same one about James Clear, is what would be more interesting than talking to James Clear about habits is talking to James Clear about, how he operationalizes his business, and something that's kind of behind the scenes that he's not known for, but is actually, something that he has thought a lot about and probably has pretty good ideas. And so I think that would be another one that, to me, yeah, I do want to build my brand around my ideas around podcasting stuff. But when somebody comes to me and says like, hey, I want to talk about this thing that you haven't talked about before, and it's this kind of different angle that immediately stands out from other pitches that I have. And so that goes a long way. In terms of like after they've kind of agreed and said yes, I think just being very clear with, what they need to do. Is this going to be video? How should they prepare? As a guy who, rolls out of bed, and maybe I should do more with my hair, it's not a big deal for me, but certainly with pitching women, like I know that is always a thing, like video or not, like how much do I need to prep to do this? Is the video going to be on? Is it going to be off? Is this going to be shared? And a lot of people will talk about that, and guests have asked me frequently, like, I just need to know how much I need to prepare before coming on this, visually, to get whatever I need to do. And I'm always like, oh yeah, I guess I don't really think about that, but certainly a lot of people do. And so making sure that there's no kind of, ambiguity around what they need to do to prep. Some people like having questions or at least topics sent over, so that can be a way to help people get comfortable. Some people like to do pre-interviews. This depends a lot on your show and like the level of kind of rapport that you want to establish beforehand. So this can be tough if you're like aiming for really big guests. A lot of times you can't get more of their, like, it's almost like they're doing you a favor to give you 30 minutes of their time for the interview, and you're not going to get an additional 15 just to chat beforehand. But if you have the clout, that can be a nice way to help warm them up, set expectations, and also, just get straight into the content when you get on. Beyond that, I always like to plan, if I'm going to do a 45-minute interview, I want to do, at least an hour kind of time block on the calendar, or maybe even an hour 15, to be able to just like chat back and forth before getting into it and help just warm them up. I often like to be recording that whole time, and so that I don't have to stop and say like, hey, we're just going to start the interview now. It's kind of like it's already going, the tape's rolling, and you can just kind of like ease into it when the time is right. And that to me is like often leads to a better kind of transition into the interview, and it's not so like, oh, now we're on and I'm going to like stiffen up or anything like that. So I think a lot of it is just around like, once you get on, making them feel comfortable, telling them, yeah, this is a simple one too, just saying like, this is going to be edited, so if you mess up, just let me know. Say, speak to the editor, say like, editor, can we just cut that, and I'll restart. And you kind of like let them know that like, there doesn't need to be any pressure here. Like, I'm on your side. I'm not going to like use any of this against you or whatever, because most of us aren't. We're not doing adversarial kind of like journalistic interviews or anything like that. And kind of lowering the stakes, connecting with them on a personal basis, and then like kind of getting into the interview. I think all of that goes a long way.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Go for it, Jamie.
I have a question. Yeah, so I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on marketing a podcast, because a lot of ones that are very popular, I notice, have just tons of ads. And it's like, and it kind of turns me off after a certain point, where you're like, oh, I just listened to 5 minutes ads, and now and there's another 5 minutes ad. And, I struggle with that, because I have a short form content podcast that's like 20 to 30 minutes of their day. And I've tried different things, and like, that's the thing. And so what I don't want to do is jam it full of a bunch of other things. And so I'm curious your thoughts on like how to effectively market without going that route, because I feel like that would just turn my audience off.
Yeah. And so in terms of marketing, you're talking getting more listeners to the podcast, or more podcast listeners into, okay.
Yeah, getting more listeners. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because I do solo right now. So. Okay.
Yeah, I think ads are, in terms of just increasing audience, ads are not doing anybody any favors. Of course, it's helpful for revenue generation and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of growing the audience, I would say stay away from that, especially with short form. I think there's a few things to think about, as I was talking or mentioning with Steven's question before, that like differentiation and show concept or format, having that be really clear, that like somebody from the outside can immediately see what makes this different from other shows. I mean, even from like a messaging and packaging perspective, just clarity. This is something that is so often overlooked. There's like a vague title. The cover art isn't quite clear by the title and cover art, which is what most people come across first. It's just not clear who this is for or what this is for. It could be interpreted in many ways. And so, you know, a lot of times there will be additional context when somebody comes across the show, but not always. And so I think like we want to stack the deck in our favor and make sure like anywhere somebody comes across this, they have at least a pretty good sense, like they could get 70% of the way there to like the problem this solves, who it's for, like why would I listen to this? And so that is an issue for many shows that is pretty easy to clean up and helps with all of your marketing. Beyond that, I think a lot of people don't they think that the podcast just producing more content is going to grow it. And there's, you know, podcast SEO is not great, and I think it's going to be getting better. And so there's certainly a lot you can do with just like optimizing your titles, your show title, your author tag, your description, all of those things for search, like you would, you know, a website. And so it's much more rudimentary than Google with podcasting. And so it's kind of like, you don't need to know like a ton about being an SEO nerd to do a pretty good job of that, but just like making sure your keywords are getting in your episode titles regularly. Hopefully one of your keywords is your primary one is in your show title, or kind of like the description for it. That might come after the show title. You can do like show title, colon, you know, whatever, which is technically Apple doesn't like that, but they say that your show can get taken down for it. And I have seen it happen in the past, but it rarely does, which is super annoying, their enforcement of it. Beyond that, then I think like it's like, for me, I find it easier to promote my email list and then use the email list to promote the podcast. And so I think there's a lot less friction in a lot of places, especially on social, to get people to sign up to a newsletter than it is to get them to sign up to a podcast. Because for some reason, even though, yeah, I could just like go to the podcast, click subscribe immediately and listen to it later, I don't know. I don't really engage with podcasts that way. Like before I subscribe, I'm going to listen to an episode and, I'm on social right now, so I don't have 30 minutes to listen to an episode, or even 15. I'm in like 8 seconds per, Instagram post mode. I'm not in like 15 minutes for a podcast episode mode. And so it's like, I should remember that. I'll think about it later. Whereas a newsletter, I'm like, I'll sign up now and I'll get the next issue whenever it comes. And that's really easy for me. So there's some kind of like weird platform psychology stuff going on that I personally often will coach people. If you do both of those things, like make the newsletter the destination and then promote the podcast through the newsletter regularly, because now you've got, potentially infinite touch points with that person until they unsubscribe. And so that's a great way to do it. But other than that, you could take the other approach and just say, like, I'm going to make it super clear everywhere that people interact with me that, like, I have a podcast, this is where to find it. And it's like the one primary option that I want you to take that next step. So I think you often are more discoverable than the podcast. And so making sure that, like, wherever you're showing up, people can see, like, oh, here's the podcast, here's who it's for, here's what it's for, here's why you should listen, and making that kind of unavoidable.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you.
Yeah. And I guess I'd just add to that, like any other marketing stuff you do, like guesting on shows, collaborations, cross promotions, we can do any of that stuff and point it to anything. And so you can think about applying those to the podcast as well.
Right. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. What are the biggest failures you've seen in podcast hosts and podcast guests?
I mean, podcast guests is a lot of people, a lot of people are like not that interesting, and and I think there's like, because podcast guesting has become a tactic, I think a lot of people have gone to it and be like, oh, this is a great way to grow my audience, when they don't have a distinct point of view. They don't know how to tell stories in an engaging way. They don't know like how to talk about their content in a way that will get people excited to take the next step and follow them back to what they're doing. That is by far, I think, the biggest shortcoming of podcast guests. And I think really like the point of view thing as a host and a guest is, I think, becoming more and more important, especially as we get into, AI generated content world, where information there are way easier ways to get information than to listen to an hour-long podcast. And like, I could read a blog post and get all the core bits much faster. And so I think when we're thinking about any kind of podcast, like, why are people going to listen to podcasts? It's because there's going to be some kind of experiential element that is beyond pure like information download into my brain, because there's more efficient ways to do that. And so I think as a host and a guest, both, whichever side you're on, I think it's worth thinking about, like, what is the experience I'm creating for people that is memorable for them. And so I think storytelling is a big one, whether we're conveying information through stories or just like getting people to connect with us through stories. That's going to be a big one, for especially for guests. I think hosts, if you do an interview show, maybe you don't need to be as much of a storyteller yourself, but understanding how do I pull stories out of guests and ask questions in a way that lead to stories and can get past guests kind of like one word answers, or really like how to get them off script, but also get them to breathe more life into the things they're talking about, which is certainly an art, not something that any of us likely naturally do. And so, studying people, our favorite shows, like what are they doing to do this? But then as a guest, like I think we can take a much more structured approach to that, because we already know the things we want to talk about. And so if we can say like, okay, well, this is the outcome I want people to sign up to my email list, to listen to my own podcast, to buy my product or service. Like, what are the key stories that somebody needs to know to get to know me, to get to know the impact of the work I do, why this work matters? And you can say like, okay, well, these are the three things I mainly talk about during podcast interviews. I can probably come up with some stories that, take somebody through this in a way that's not just like me beating them over the head with this information or this like sales pitch. And so I think just doing that, you can do that in like, an afternoon and say like, okay, I want to get on 50 shows in the next year. And so I want to talk about these things. So I only need to come up with a few stories to cover a few circumstances. And I'm going to be, a much, much better guest than I would be otherwise if I'm just, talking about, this off the cuff. And I mean, anybody who does, I think like being a writer, you develop that skill a lot more effectively. And so that's something that I even recommend to people sometimes, to say like, okay, like just whether or not you publish these blog posts or essays, like think about, like write down the things that you want to talk about on shows when you're a guest. Like take the time to write down, do 10 blog posts over the next month or two, because you will hash out and structure those essays or those blog posts and the stories within them so much more concisely than if you're trying to do it just in your head off the cuff. And then once you publish those blog posts, now you'll be able to just like come back to them time and time and time again. Whereas I feel like now at this point I've published, 500 plus blog posts, and there's so many like stories that when I get asked questions on podcast guest interviews, I'm like, oh, I already know the story I wrote about that. I know that I've got this metaphor that leads into this lesson or whatever. I can cite this research or whatever that I looked up, and it's just like it's all kind of top of mind because you've already done the work to like commit it to your own memory. And whether or not somebody ever reads that blog post, has been helpful for me in structuring my thinking around this topic that I talk a lot about. So that's a bit time intensive way to do it if you want to like go and write all those blog posts first, but those can probably also work for you within your content ecosystem as well. So I think those would be the two things I think in terms of hosting and guesting, ways to level up, but also failures for people.
Thank you for that. Any last questions from anybody? Go for it, Colin.
So when you're like people are promoting, I know some people will promote clips, right? What do you feel the best clips to promote? I had two questions too. It's like inside. When I listen to podcasts, some have an intro, like they like show an episode to kind of tease you, and then they go into it. Is there a format that works, or just go right into it? Like you already kind of like intro the person, go into it, or is like do you do like a teaser, almost like a trailer, and then go into it?
So I used to do the teaser clips, and now I don't really recommend it anymore. Not because it's necessarily like bad, it's just not the best way. And so I think if you listen to any highly produced like NPR style show, they very rarely will pull a clip for the start of the episode. Usually it starts with the host narrating, and in the first 30 seconds you've got that hook. And it's much easier to hook somebody when you're intentionally doing it as a host and you're actually scripting that, rather than just trying to find some clip from the episode that a listener coming in with zero context is enough to hook them. And it's really hard to find clips that do that really well. And so I would usually start off, write like, 100-word description. Maybe it's the same thing you use as the description for the show, or for the episode. And so you just like script that, narrate it, and within 30 seconds people know like the problem that this episode addresses, why this guest is the right person to talk about it, and you can kind of build in some tension there. So I think that is what I would much prefer as a listener. It's easier to get people engaged early on because you have complete control over that, rather than trying to like find something interesting because this is the way you always do your episodes. And often there is not a great clip. Like a lot of times from episodes, there's some great information, but the guest says it over 3 minutes, and it's hard to like pull down to like a 15-second clip that's actually hooks people in. And so typically I would avoid that. And then from the social sharing clip perspective, it depends on how you do your show and like what your content is, but like the best possible way to do it is through like newsjacking type stuff or trend jacking, where something's like hot right now, and so you specifically ask the guest about it, and you can pull that clip that people are interested in already talking about. And so whether like it would depend a lot on I don't know what my video is doing here. Let's go back to there we go. And so if there's like AI has obviously been hot in the past while, so a lot of people are pulling clips around AI. But even if you're getting more specific of like this new company just released, this new feature, if you're in tech or something like that, and it's like very topical, very like time sensitive perhaps, and like that's the clip you pull, like that's probably going to do really well on social media. Whereas something that's more timeless or evergreen might be harder to pull as a clip. But maybe if you title that well and put it onto YouTube, maybe there is some like long tail juice there where people are going to keep coming back to that over time. So I think the one thing is thinking about like what's relevant right now and how can I create clips around that, because that's probably going to do better than like more timeless stuff, at least on social media, which is so kind of like what's relevant, what's urgent right now. But then the other thing you could look at is saying like maybe your show isn't super, maybe the point of your show is that it's evergreen and more timeless. And then I would think a lot about pulling maybe even a bit longer clips, but being very specific with your titling, and especially for YouTube, and saying like, okay, how can I optimize this for something that people are always searching for? And I almost maybe want to like in my episodes make sure that I'm asking questions going in that I know like this is a question that people search for, and so I'm going to address it with this guest. And so that then I can also have this clip that I can put up on YouTube and can get me some kind of long tail SEO juice over the next however long.
Thank you.
Very cool.
That was awesome.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Jeremy, do you have a hard stop? Because I know Mark had a question. I just want to double check.
Nope.
Okay. For anybody that does have a hard stop, next month on Friday, the 21st, Jonathan Bailey Strong, who did the podcast for Lowe's House, and Tim Ferriss, he's going to be here. Jeremy, you're more than welcome to come too if you want to go pick his brain nowadays. So everyone here is invited. If you are not on the calendar invite, let me know and I will put you on the calendar invite. So that's going to be really, really fun. And he's going to be doing best in B2B podcasting. So speaking specifically about B2B, and I know some of his new juice is around more around the guesting side. So like also how to be a really great guest, as well as everything that we're talking about as hosts, and how to use that for lead generation. So I'm excited for that. So I just wanted to let everybody know. You are very welcome. See you later, Stephen. Mark, what is your question? I know you had one.
It's the flip side of the early question you asked, which is what's the worst failures? What are the most surprising strengths or things that you've seen that have worked in podcasting?
I think this is very personal. I think so. And this goes beyond podcasting, but more of like to the, I think about it a lot in terms of like creators who are very much more personality focused maybe than business owners a lot of times. But I think a lot of us, if we have personal brands and things like that, we are ultimately at the center, even if we do want to operationalize it and scale it beyond ourselves. And I think what's really interesting to me is I've been wanting to do, I don't know if I'll ever somebody steal this idea and do it if you want, but because I've been wanting to do it forever, but I don't know if I actually will. But I want to do a show or a newsletter or something that's about essentially like, why this works for this person, and break down their content. And because when I do this kind of in my brain, I'm like, why is this person successful? And it is so often, it's almost all the time. It's 100% of the time. It's not even almost all the time. It's 100% of the time completely unique to that person. Of like, it is not you can't copy it. There's like tactics that they use and there's frameworks that they use, but those get them like 70% of the way there, and then like the rest is their secret sauce of like something, and it's just like they are just extremely likable in this specific way that like no one else can be that combination of these traits that are make them so magnetic. And so I think a lot about like looking at people and like what makes them, why am I interested in this, or why do other people like this? And it's always unique. And there's things that, you know, do overlap, and that there's, you know, different versions of likability or authority or credibility or, you know, whatever it is, controversy, but everybody has their own unique flavor of it. And so I think the real secret is like tapping into like, what's my unique flavor of this? And probably what most people do is they cover it up because they're looking at something else and they're like, oh, what that person's doing over there, that's what people want because they have a big platform, and so I should be more like that. Whereas takes way more bravery to say like, okay, no, probably the way to achieve my potential is to uncover the thing that nobody else is doing yet, that people actually want uniquely from me, which is, I don't know that there's like a way to uncover that in a systematic way that we can just say, oh, just do these steps and you'll uncover that unique thing about yourself. I think like getting feedback from your audience and talking with the people around you, and I'm kind of trying to uncover like, okay, what do people come to me for that I am probably taking for granted? And then how can I like lean into that more? And like one of the things for me, I didn't even really realize it about myself, but one of my my old marketing assistant, she told me at one point, I was training her on a bunch of my writing. She was like rewriting blog posts so that she could kind of write in my voice. And at one point she was just like, man, you just like your writing style is so, you just like write in metaphors. And I was like, really? And I was like, I in hindsight, I look back and I was like, oh, that's like cool, like, because that's what, you know, I think a lot of the writers I look up to do. I didn't do it intentionally, but now many other people have, like, they comment on that regularly, and because since then I like lean into it. I'm like, oh, this is part of my style, and this is part of when people have the best experience with my work, this is what I'm doing, and like this is clearly when I'm at my best, even if I didn't realize it. And so that's been something that's been interesting to like notice that feedback and say, oh, maybe I should do more of that and build that into my style, kind of. And then the second thing I'll say is that I heard this quote. I can't even remember who it was from, but it was around like finding your voice, essentially. And it was about like, you don't need to go, you don't need to find your voice. You need to release the handbrake that's keeping it back. And I was like, oh, that is it. Like, I think we all have our voice and we all are like throttling it back because either subconsciously or because we actively think this is not what it takes to be successful. And I think one of the things I've realized is that like the stuff that gets the best results for me is when I'm like my purest self, kind of like the stuff that resonates most with me is probably going to resonate most with other people. And it feels like there's some like weird, you know, mystical, magical stuff going on there, because it feels like when I look at this and I'm like, this is not following, this is like breaking a lot of the rules, but like I feel this, and somehow that gets translated to other people. And I think through like, you know, a podcast where like people get your energy through that, and, you know, showing up on video and even like your best, you know, writing or whatever, I think that comes through and is often, especially in business, kind of like discarded because you can't prove that like this is the best practice. But I think like having the freedom to kind of like break the rules and say like, this is what I want to create. I'll give one more example here because I know we're over time here. In my newsletter, I typically write essays, or in my one newsletter, about kind of creative work and a lot of like the internal, like how do we navigate our way to our creative potential. But a lot of times, like a few times a year, maybe like 6, 7, I'll write a poem, and it'll be about like a poem about marketing or creative work or something like that. And those ones always get by far the highest response rate. And people will ask me sometimes, they're like, so like usually you write essays and you have this kind of standard format, but then you'll like go and write a poem or something like that. Like, what are you doing there? I'm like, I just felt it that week, and like it feels like the thing that people are getting from me is not necessarily the format. Like I do want to have a consistent format matters, but the deeper thing for people who've been around me for a while is like the insight or the ideas or the experience that they get from me. And so if sometimes the idea I want to communicate comes through in a poem, and it's kind of weird and it's kind of out there, and they probably don't get other newsletters on business and creativity and marketing that have poetry in them. And so like that stands out. And so I would love to do a newsletter that was just marketing poetry, but I don't have the creative, I don't know, juice right now to do that. That feels a little daunting. So for now, I'm just going to like do it when I feel like it. And a lot of times those are the things that like feel like this gets my like best version of this idea, my best self out there, even though like nobody would tell you like, yeah, you know, you should think about for your next newsletter, just write a poem about marketing, and like that's the best practice right now.
That makes me laugh because I'll do sometimes music parodies. And those always get responses like was it like Prince of Bel-Air, like, you know, for the holidays, just, and people are like, what the fuck? And they're like, damn you, I can't get that like thing out of my head. So I totally get that. Jeremy, my last question for you is, I guess you get to pick one, right? Either what is the advice in podcasting that you wish you could give more often, but I feel like you're the type of person that's just going to give it anyway, or that you wish people would take more often? You're like, so one or the other.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody knows the YouTuber Matt Diavella. He's got a really big channel, but I came across this video of his a month ago or 2 months ago, and it was his 3-year rule, he called it. And basically he said, you know, when I go to do a creative project, and he's actually the filmmaker behind the Minimalists documentary, which was huge on Netflix.
Oh yeah.
So he very accomplished as a filmmaker and then a YouTuber as well. And he said, like, whenever I'm doing a new creative project, I don't start it unless I am committed to doing 3 years of it before reassessing whether it's worth doing. And I always think about that with podcasting, of like, it is going to take time to gain traction. It is going to take time to find your voice. Even if you've done podcasting and content before, like, I feel for myself, every new project takes at least a year to figure out, like, what the hell is this thing? Like, I had this idea going into it, but you need to figure it out even when you're really experienced. And I think a lot of that, like, you only get there through repetitions. And so when, you know, so many people with any marketing thing, they're like, you know, I need this to get results. I want to get results quickly. Obviously, we all do. But I think when you're thinking about content and podcasting, most of the benefit is going to come after the 2 or 3 year mark. And so most people give up way before that. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that either. Like, I've started shows where I got in and 6 months in, I was like, this is the wrong project for me. Like, this is maybe this is going to get results from like a strategy perspective, but I hate doing this. And there's no way I can actually stick with this personally long enough to get those results. And so probably I'd be better off putting that energy somewhere else. And so I think like monitoring that and just kind of being like, okay, I'm not going to make any big drastic decisions about whether this show is successful or not till, like, you know, I'm going to do a check-in at, you know, 6 months and a year or whatever, see if I need to make tweaks. But like, I'm not going to judge this as a failure because it hasn't, you know, met my expectations that early. And so I think the flip side to that, part of it's about being patient with assessing the results. But I think there's also this, if you go in with the mindset of, I'm going to do this for 3 years before I make the call on whether I'm going to keep doing this, I think that makes you think differently about how you're creating the content and like the type of content you're creating. And the process becomes much more important, of like, you're saying like, okay, if I'm going to do this for 3 years, like, I need to make this enjoyable and like fun for myself. I need to be getting something personally out of this in the meantime before the subscribers come and the revenue comes and all of that. And I think usually the people who are really successful would do the show, would do the newsletter, would do the YouTube channel, like, even if those results weren't guaranteed or weren't going to come, because they're getting something out of it personally in the meantime. So I think that's the advice I give most often. A lot of people, I don't know that they don't agree with it, but they think it's crazy to think that you would like have to wait that long. Why would I do something that I would have to wait 3 years to like see any results on? Whereas I think you look at high performers and they're like always the people looking like, I'm playing like the 10-year game or the 30-year game here.
Mm-hmm. It's not embodied. Is what came to mind. All right. Well, Jeremy, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and sharing your time and energy. Again, if you want to come in July, you can email me and I'll put you on the calendar. No pressure. And for everybody else, have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. This will end up in the Tinker Talks inside of Kajabi. And Jeremy, if there's any links to the course, any of that stuff, we'll just put resources as well for all of Jeremy's goodies and treats in there so that everyone has access to it. So thank you so much. And I'm going to email you to geek out on something called Point of View, which I am really distilling, which I think you and I would very much geek out on. So I will do that. All right, everybody, have a wonderful weekend.
See you. Thanks for
Ciao.
coming, everyone.